Hi everyone. I'm really happy to be with Gordon Brown, aka Morgan Cry. It's always good to see you coming on because you sort of write under two different names.
I do, yeah. I know it used to be Morgan Cry when I first did it was a couple of books I did for Polygon back in COVID, and they did okay, but during COVID there was an awful lot of nonsense, and then I went back to Gordon Brown. But now it's firmly Morgan Cry, which is odd when I'm on events and I'm sitting there and someone says, "Well, Morgan," they ask you a question, and I say nothing. I'm sitting there blankly thinking, "Who's Morgan?" Oh no, that's me, right? Okay, I'll answer the question. So I've got to get used to it. It's also my brother's name and it's also my dad's name. So Morgan's a really odd name to go by because I've lived with the name in the house for God knows how long, and then suddenly I'm using it.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you where you got it from, but is it because it's your...
It's the story's well. What happened was I've been writing under Gordon Brown for ages, and I think I've said before when I've been on UK Crime Book Club, Gordon Brown is a bit of a divisive name. And when I first started, it was quite bad because he was actually Prime Minister at the time. But I was bloody minded and thought, I want to do this. But when I pitched a couple of books to Berlin, which were expat crime books set out in Spain, and they liked him and they took them, but they didn't want to use my name. And they said, look, you really need to think about another name. And that's kind of odd. It's hard to come up with another name for yourself. So the way I went about it was I just said, right, okay, so what looks good? And I was thinking long word, short word. I mean, this sounds really daft. Or is it short word, long word? It's like what works best? And then I thought, I quite like Morgan on the basis it was my dad's, and my dad's no longer with us, but it was my dad's name. But it's my younger brother's name, and it's also one of my other brother's middle name, and it was my grandmother's maiden name. So my grandmother only had one child, my father, and she didn't want to lose her maiden name, so she called him Morgan, which in Scotland at the time was an odd name, and I just liked it. So I had to phone my brother though and say, look, I'm thinking of naming myself Morgan, and there was a kind of silence at the end of the phone, and then he kind of went, really? I said, no, it's only for a couple of books, don't worry about it, not knowing I was then going to do more books. And Cry, I don't know why. It was just because it was crime. But you should have seen the list of names. Oh my God. I wish some of them were just so ridiculous. But I kept going through names thinking, what would it look like in a book cover? But I had to come up with something. And then eventually they didn't give me any time. They just said, look, we need something. So Morgan Cry it became.
Great. Well, normally we start off getting people to introduce themselves and their books. So do you want to tell us a bit about the latest book?
So the latest book's The Fracture, which is the book here. So that's The Fracture, which is the second in a series with a protagonist called Blake Glover. That was the first one. The first one was called The Cost. The books, just to let you know the background to the books, are set in Fraserburgh, which is a town on the northeast shoulder of Scotland. Predominantly was a fishing town, and the premise behind the books is that Blake was a police constable in Glasgow for 30 years. And for 30 years, he walked the beat. He wasn't a detective, he was a constable. He walked the beat. And at the end of in the first book, at the end of his time, before he retires, he tries to fit somebody up. That's not a plot spoiler, it's right at the beginning of the first book. And it leaves in disgrace and really can't stay in Glasgow. So he decides to go home. And his childhood home was Fraserburgh. But the reason he didn't want to go back is he is firmly of the belief that he was responsible, in part, if not all, for his mother's death some 40 years earlier. So he's never been back. So the first book was a kind of coming home book. And it was more about Blake rediscovering himself and who he was and who his family was in the background. But the premise for the book's quite simple, which is in the first book, it's a missing person. It's a small crime, a very small crime. Someone asks him to investigate a missing person, which then blows up to something much bigger. But I think the point of difference in the books is that he never was a detective. That wasn't ever the premise, and he was never a private detective. He's not an he was a constable on the beat, so he knows how to handle people. But when it comes to investigation, he's a bit heavy-handed, and he's a bit not out his depth. It's just that he's got a way of doing things. And the interesting bit for me is that also when a lot of police come out, it's hard for them to shake off the fact that they don't have a uniform anymore, the authority that came with it. So when it came to the second book, it's still set in Fraserburgh, although it's split between Fraserburgh and Glasgow. And the reason for Glasgow is his frenemy. So what's the best way to explain Mitch? He has a guy he started the police with, who then turned out to be one of the biggest criminals in Scotland, still thinks he's friends with Blake and tugs at Blake's strings all the time, won't let him go. And in the second book, Mitch is in prison and more or less blackmails Blake to come to Glasgow to do a job for. I won't say what the job is, but he has to come down to do it. And therefore, the book is Blake trying to deal with his past catching up with him. But then that sounds too simple. So there's a couple of other stories to it. So it kind of opens with Blake, who's now a taxi driver in Fraserburgh, dropping off a guy at 2 o'clock in the morning in the town. And the next day he finds out that the guy probably killed himself. You don't know. There's a whole bunch of stuff around it. But they find his clothes on the beach up at Fraserburgh. And Blake was the last person to see him alive. And Blake wonders what happens. And that starts to gnaw away at him, that he was the last person to see him alive. And then the following day, he's at a funeral of a friend of his mother's. There's a friend's, he's one of the few there. It's a storm, it's a really bad day, and the coffin gets dropped by mistake into the grave, and he thinks he sees it split. And he thinks, well, that shouldn't happen. Like, a coffin doesn't split. You know, they're solid. So that sets him on this journey of, you know, is someone swapping out cheap coffins for, you know, expensive coffins? So the three stories run together through the book, and they're tied. But the whole idea was each one on its own is a relatively small start, but what it builds up to is quite big by the end of the book. So there's three different threads to the book throughout the book, and Blake is the only common factor amongst all of them, and Blake's the one that ends up trying to fix it, which is why the strapline for this is, you know, everybody has a breaking point. And for Blake, it's the fact that he's got these three things going on as well as everything else in his life. And he's a taxi driver. He used to be a police officer, but he's a taxi driver. But he is driven to try and fix stuff. He spent 30 years of his life doing it, and he can't just let it go. So that's what the second book's about.
Cool. Sarah Blackburn saying hello.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for coming along. I'm just saying thanks for coming along.
Yeah, for the benefit of Sarah and everyone else who's watching, we should probably explain that you're not getting the usual UK CBC service, because normally you would have had Sam, who will have lovingly read your book, ready for it, but we swapped over tonight and I haven't had a chance.
No, but Kaz has stepped in. It's great of you to step in. I know you haven't read the book. That's fine. That's okay. But nice of you to step in. And, you know, as I said with Sam, I hope everything's okay. But from my end, it's nice that you stepped in and not read the book, although you've had a whole 2 hours to read it. I mean, come on.
Well, I mean, I'm good, but I'm not that good. So Fraserburgh, I'm going to guess is a real place, because you said that he also goes to Glasgow.
Yeah, so Fraserburgh is actually a place, population about 12,000, sits in the northeast shoulder. If you look at Scotland, not up where John O'Groats says, where the shoulder is, just above Aberdeen, about 40 miles north of Aberdeen, there's Fraserburgh. Fraserburgh, you don't go, it's not on the way to anywhere. It's literally sits on the very shoulder. The reason it's Fraserburgh, and I kind of have to explain the background to this, is my father was in the Glasgow police. So my dad was in the police in the 60s and 70s. But he was born and raised in Fraserburgh. That's where he grew up. My grandparents on his side were from there. My dad served his time as an apprentice in one of the local engineering called the Toolworks or the Toolies. Left, went to do his national service, which he did back then with the army for 2 years, but then decided to come to Glasgow. Didn't go back to Fraserburgh. Met my mum, joined the police, and served for 25 years in the police. And all our childhood, I've got 3 brothers, and the 4 of us, plus my mum and my dad, at the drop of a hat, we'd go to Fraserburgh. If it was a weekend, go to Fraserburgh. Holidays, we didn't go anywhere else for 16 years. Fraserburgh was it for me, which is a bit weird, because I really knew nobody else that knew Fraserburgh, and I kept going on about this place. And it's not a tourist town, I wouldn't say, you know. It's got a lovely beach, 5 Mile Beach, absolutely gorgeous. It's got a good bit of history, but it kind of got in the blood because we just kept going back up. We used to stay in a caravan, 6 of us in a caravan designed for 4 people for like 2 weeks, plus an Afghan hound. It was like ridiculous. It didn't make any sense. And because of that, my dad used to talk about going back to Fraserburgh when he finished with the police. Unfortunately, my dad, like Blake, became a taxi driver only in Glasgow. My father passed away when he was 48, so he was only a couple of years out of the police when he actually died. And when I came to write this book, it was almost taking my dad. I was kind of thinking, what if he had gone back? Now, this book is easily 30 years further forward in time, but the whole thought process was, what was it like to go back? So the reason I chose Fraserburgh is I'm lazy when it comes to writing about places, because I know it inside out and backwards from my childhood. I wouldn't say I know it that well just now. I've been up quite a few times, but as a town, I didn't know anybody else that had set anything there. B, it has had its problems in the past, but it was one of Europe's biggest fishing ports. It was a massive, massive business in its own right. And it kind of just is part of me. And the first photograph I ever have of me, my only photograph of me under the age of 2, is sitting on my mum's knee on the beach at Fraserburgh. And the second photograph I have is me sitting on the beach in Fraserburgh. I didn't live there. We just went up. So when I came to do this book, it was a kind of, my dad kind of felt like he was on my shoulder. I was just saying, what if my dad had gone home? You know, and that's kind of kicked off the thought process about what happens if you're not been there for years. In his case, he had. In Blake's case, he's not been back in 40 years. What happens when you go home? What happens when you meet people from back then? What about the stories that you maybe didn't know about? Stuff that happened when you were younger that you never really, because kids' lives, and I've always said this, kids are unaware of what's happening in a lot of cases. I'm not saying they don't know, because kids know more than you think. But the good thing is, from a book point of view, stuff going on back then, 40 years later, he's back up finding out about it. And I kind of wondered what would happen if you went back up. So that's why I use Fraserburgh. So it really is a place. It's not a made-up place. There's 12,000 people there. I've been back up frequently. I had the joy, and I'm only saying this because it's the moment, is my grandfather was heavily involved with the local football team, Fraserburgh FC. Fraserburgh are in the Highland League, which is the league below the professional league in Scotland. And my grandfather was secretary in there. He did all sorts of jobs through the 60s and 70s. As kids, we used to get thrown on the team bus and sent off to some of the wilds to watch the team when we were younger. It was my mum and dad's way of getting free time. And my grandfather, I got back in touch with the football club, got in touch with the chairman, got in touch with both the chair and the secretary, and I've been back up a few times. And last time I went up, I got a photograph with me and the chairman standing on Bellslea Park. Now, I know people that want to stand in Wembley, or want to stand on Old Trafford, or want to stand in the Bernabeu, or they want to stand in Hampden, but I wanted to stand on Bellslea Park in Fraserburgh, and the grin in my face is just stupid.
I'm presuming that all of those other places you just named after Wembley were also football stadiums.
Well, they're all football, yeah. So Old Trafford, Man United, Bernabeu, Real Madrid, etc. Yeah, they're all famous football grounds, but I wanted to stand on Bellslea Park in Fraserburgh, and you should see the smile on my face just because I'm standing on the football park. It's ridiculous. So Fraserburgh was part of me, and that's why I chose to do it. It's taken me 12 books to get there, but it's part of me, so that's why I chose it.
It's interesting when you write about towns like that I presume, because you said it was a big fishing port, have these industries. It's making me think about like Hull in Yorkshire, have this industry that's like really central to it, and then it kind of goes and it changes the town a little bit, doesn't it, as well?
Well, fishing became much harder because when they put quotas in Europe, the fleets that used to sit in Fraserburgh went down. The number of boats there went down, and the boats also got bigger. They're absolutely massive. And unlike Peterhead and Aberdeen and some of the other ones down the coast, Fraserburgh never really benefited from North Sea oil. So some of the other towns really benefited from North Sea oil. Fraserburgh, for various reasons, didn't benefit from it. So the town had a kind of hardish time because there wasn't a backup when fish went away. But it does well, but it is one of those towns where I kind of say, like, I'm not saying it's like Hull, but there's various towns where you're only going there because you're going there. It's not like one of the ones where you say, well, I'm passing through because I'm going somewhere else. It very much is a town. And it is of its own. I've got to be careful because the other thing about writing about a town is I don't live there, and therefore I kind of have a fear of God. I'm doing a reading at the or reading an hour or so at the library that people are just going to pull me up in the book. that's wrong. This is not right. That doesn't happen. It's like this is some of this is Fraserburgh from when I was a kid. Some of it is today's Fraserburgh. I've been up, walked the streets. I actually took a photograph of every major place in the first book, and then realised I'd made a couple of mistakes.
Oh no.
Yeah, not major ones. Just that thing about you turn left and it's a right, or if anyone notices it, you get it now and again. You get and some people notice it, some people won't. My favourite, which is not to do with the book, to do with the fracture, was my very, very first book was called Falling. So it came out in 2009, shows how long ago it was, set in Glasgow. And right at the very end, towards the end of the book, the main protagonist gets onto the Glasgow Underground, onto the subway. Now, famously, the Glasgow subway is a circle. Well, it's an oval, but it goes round. So it doesn't matter what side you go on, you will eventually end up where you want to be. And the guy was going from one stop to another stop. And I put this in and I said, right, okay, well, they're going from X to Y. And someone wrote to me and said, no, they're on the wrong platform. I went, it doesn't matter what platform you're on. And they went, no, they went the long way around. I went, no, they didn't. They didn't go the long way around. But I took my book up the next day and I walked into the subway station. I'm reading my book and it goes down the stairs, turns left, goes through the sundial, down the other set of stairs, turns left, stands in the platform. And I went, they're right. Wrong platform. There's only 2 platforms and I put them in the wrong one. And someone actually wrote that. Someone wrote in to tell me, and I'm like, how did you ever spot that? So it just shows you.
People do. There's always someone who's quite pedantic or write something in, won't they? You was also saying that no one else has set something there. Is that a thing you have to think about when you're writing stuff set in Scotland? Because it is the home of so many wonderful crime writers. It must be hard to find a place that isn't written about or doesn't already have a really cool fictional detective or policeman.
I think there's probably more fictional detectives per square foot in Scotland than anywhere else on the planet. I mean, you can go from St Andrews to it doesn't matter where you can go, you can find detectives. And more so, okay, there's well-known ones. You can say, well, Ian Rankin, it's got Rebus, which is set in Edinburgh, or Quentin Jardin with Skinner, or there's a whole bunch of them that but every year there's a whole bunch of debut novels come along. And a lot of those are set in various different places. I think the difficulty with setting something in a small town is that it can be quite restrictive compared to a big city. Because a big city is a kind of big landscape to paint on. And also, you can, historically in a big city, you can drift back. I mean, if you read Liam McIlvanney or Alan Park's work set in the early 70s, it's a completely different Glasgow. It's not the Glasgow of today. Smaller towns it's harder to do. That's why in the first book it's set in Fraserburgh, but the second book it actually flicks between Fraserburgh and Glasgow. He gets dragged back down to Glasgow, and it's partly because if you just keep inside the boundaries of Fraserburgh, it kind of felt to me it would end up being more like a locked room mystery. You're within a very small confine, but actually that's quite interesting because it forces you to think more about what you're saying and what you're doing, because you haven't got to get out of jail and say, well, we'll just go on the train and go 20 miles this way. Actually, and also the other thing about small towns is, and it is true of any small town, is people know each other much better. So stuff that goes on in the town, word spreads really quickly. In the first book and the second book, that's one of Blake's undoings, is in Glasgow, although there was a rumour mill where he was in the police, Glasgow's too big for that unless you're in an area. Whereas in Fraserburgh, very quickly he realises anything he does, almost by the next day, people know what's happened because he's a stranger in town. But you're true. I mean, I've lost count of how many books I've read set in the smallest of corners of Scotland. And that's the good thing about it. You talk to J.D. Kirk, you can set it up a glen somewhere, they find a body, or you want to shove somebody off a cliff somewhere, or you want to drown somebody in a pool of rocks, or, I'd rather throw someone off a high flat. More or less, it's going to be kind of hard not to find a dead body in Scotland.
Donna said hello. I've confused her by pretending to be Sam and starting our chat early. But she says, maybe a harsh question, but knowing that there are so many Scottish crime series, why should she pick yours over others?
It's a good question. Don't. It's not worth it. I would say there's 2 reasons. One is this wasn't a quick book in terms of getting to the market. I first had the idea for this book back in 2017, when I'd come out of another contract, and I really quite liked this idea, but I couldn't quite make it work. And part of the reason was because I take my dad, I played around with making it historical, i.e., setting it back in time. But I got quite far with it, and then I come up with the idea for the books in Spain, and then they took off, and then I got another book deal. But the interesting bit is then when my last publisher, Red Dog, sadly closed its door, I actually had a 3-book deal with them, but I couldn't use any of the books. And I got a new literary agent, Francesca Riccardi, from Kate Nash, and she was asking what else I got. And it was the thing that kept coming back to mind, was because I just had such a buzz about this idea of this police officer going back to Fraserburgh. And it was a passionate write from my end. And the other bit was I didn't want him to be a detective. I didn't want another detective at the end of his career or in his career. I always liked this idea that my dad was a constable, and therefore what he did every day was dealt with people on the ground on a day-to-day basis. It wasn't his job to investigate, really. It was more his job to sort the problem there and then, whatever it took to, or be the aid to everybody else. And that for me fascinated, because I'd read a lot of books, and some brilliant books with detectives or amateur sleuths, but that's not Blake. He's still Scottish, but it's not him. It's not that sort of book. And when you read it, you'll get exactly that. He's not one for figuring everything out. He gets there, but he's never going to get there the way you think he will, because he still has this thought about how you walk the beat. And walking the beat was a compromise. If you were a police officer, you had to, you have to balance out. You can't arrest everything for everybody. You have to let some things slide. Maybe you do some dodgy things in the background. And therefore, the other thing that makes this book different is I just borrowed a lot of stuff my dad had told me. My dad didn't tell me that many stories, but like, I'll give you an example, right? Our house, we wasn't growing up, was never a lot of money in our house, very, very little. But like, we had the first colour television in the scheme. We had the first stereo in the scheme. We had an Afghan hound. Like, seriously, in 1970, whatever it was, we had an Afghan hound. We got all this stuff, and the question was, where was it coming from? And it's sure as it, and my dad would just turn up with it, and you think, well, I don't know where he got it from, but it didn't sound very legit to me. And this whole thing about police officers on the ground, day to day on the beat, comes through heavily in The Fracture, because when he gets back to Glasgow, he gets back in touch with people. Because the other bit I like about this is, if you talk to detectives, they tend to know they've got a grass, or they've got people they know, the people who have got maybe a senior place. The guys on the beat, they knew the bad guys on the ground, or they knew the shopkeepers, or they knew where to go and get a free pint, or they knew. And for me, that's why I think this book sings better than any book I've ever sang, because it just feels truer to me. And it feels like the sort of thing that would happen if you quit being in the police. He's not trying to be a detective. He's not suddenly decided he wants to keep doing this. He just keeps getting dragged back into it because of his past.
And I guess, I mean, even the detectives and things who are going to solve things are going to rely on people like constables who know the people.
Yeah.
Because eventually, at the end of the day, all investigating is going to come down to the people that you know and talk to. And
yeah. And there's also a way of police detectives do it all the time, but my dad, you couldn't lie to my dad, right? You couldn't. My dad could see through it a mile away, right? And he was so used to being lied to. That's just every day you get told porkies. I didn't do it. I wasn't there. It isn't mine. There was like all the answers. And you just have this hardwired part of you that senses when you know things aren't on the right. And that's what they use. They have to use their smarts. And for me, that's the clever bit about this, is he has to be even smarter in some ways, because he now isn't a police officer. He's driving a taxi. And if you ask why a taxi, I love this, because when a number of policemen I knew that became taxi drivers are security guards after my dad, it's really obvious. Security guard, because you know what you're doing. Like, if you want to look after a building, put a policeman in charge. Taxi drivers, because they can handle anyone. Doesn't matter if you're drunk or violent. Police are used to handling it. And that's the great thing. The good thing about taxi drivers is sometimes people don't think they're there. So you hear stuff because they chat away in the back of it, or they're a confession. How did your day go, driver? Oh, mine's terrible. And the great thing about that is you pick up information in a small town very quickly. So for me, that's what makes this. I just loved writing this series. I really did. I kind of hammered through it, and I loved doing it because of that, because I really felt a connection with it, but also I just felt it's just that wee bit different. I wouldn't say it's majorly different, but it's just that wee bit different.
Donna says she's totally sold.
Fair enough. Could she summarise that and send it back, and I'll put it in the back of the book? The hardest thing to write, and I didn't do it. I mean, it's Seven House that do it, but see, writing the blurb for the back of a book, trying to write one paragraph, that takes me longer than unbelievably long time to do. I can write a book. The other bit, I think, and this is just because I was doing one recently, I had to do a few short stories, and I love short stories. I got into writing because of short stories when I was a kid, but I had to write a short story. I'm coming off my newsletter, and I'm going on to Substack in about a week's time. So I'm going to put a whole bunch of content from my newsletter and some new stuff. And I thought I'd write a short story, 1,700 words. It takes me longer to write 1,700 words than to write 20,000. Like short story, and when you get down to writing the blurb in the back of the book, I have no idea how many times I've rewritten it. And then I send it off to Seven House and they change it, which is quite right, because actually you should get someone else to do it. It's quite hard to sum up your own book.
I love collections of short stories.
Well, I actually did one. If you want an oddball collection of short stories, online it's only $1.99. There's a Kindle collection called Short Stories from a Dark Corner. So what happened was I was doing the cost, and I was waiting for the Fracture to come out. And I've got short stories I've written over the years for magazines, for online, for newsletters, for competitions I never won. And I took over a dozen of them, and I had a look at them all, and they're all over the place. Like they're weird and wonderful stories. Some have appeared in anthologies and some haven't. And I said to myself, can I publish these? And I'll give a head up to JD Kirk. Barry Hutchison gave me a hand. I mean, he was really good about this. He said, look, this is how you do it. So just to prove I could do it, with permission, Seven House were really nice about it. They said, off you go, knock your socks off. There's a collection of short stories online called Short Stories from a Dark Corner. And they are a wild mix of short stories from my entire writing career. Some of them, there's a couple in there to do with books I've written. So there's one set in Spain. There's definitely a Blake Glover story in there. There's other stories in there. There's stuff like one of the ones I really like. There's one called Gone, which wrote for one of the publishers, which I swear is a book. I absolutely swear I love the idea. It could easily be a book. And then there's a couple of other ones in there. There's one in there that I really like because it was the only time I got a mention in a writing competition. I used to enter all the time. I never won any, Writers Magazine and God knows what else. And then 1 year and 1 month, I got an honourable mention for my story. And that's in there as well. And then a couple of the other ones that are in there are from a long time ago, more than 15 years ago. And it's just a collection of, and they all are a bit dark. Most have a twist in them. One or two are not that dark. But I realised there's one about slimming. If you read that, it's really dark. I read one which is Cutting Back, which is really dark. And I thought it was actually not that dark till my wife read it and told me she thought that's ridiculous. But I like it. It's a really good story. So if you like your short stories, there's a whole bunch of them. And I think it's $1.99 on Kindle. I just put it out on Kindle and it's sitting up on Amazon.
Cool. I always think of the mixed anthologies as being like, you'll get this because you're really into music. I always think of them as being like a festival ticket, like a book of mixed story anthologies. You buy them for like the author that you know, and then you're going to discover someone else that you love.
Oh, and it's the same. I did the Bloody Scotland anthology about 5 years ago. So there's all sorts of nieces in there. Val McDermott, there's a whole bunch in there. And it was Historic Environment Scotland said to all the authors, we want to promote monuments or any Historic Environment Scotland run, like Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, some of the big monuments, and they wanted a promotional tool. A guy called Jamie Crawford, who was on at the time, approached a whole bunch of authors and said, you can pick anything you want, any major monument, and write a short story about it. And it's brilliant because everybody took a different tack. I picked a tiny little castle in the south side of Glasgow called Crookston Castle, which has no reason to. I only know it's there because when I first get married, it was about half a mile down the road from us. And that book's the same because it's all really good authors in there. The stories are really good. And you're right, you discover authors or you discover stories. And short story format is actually quite hard to do well.
Yeah, I've heard that.
It's weird though. You're saying about short music. I love my music. I am just music daft. Live music is my lifeblood. I go to more gigs than make sense. It costs way too much money. But the interesting bit is when I'm writing the book, I always have a list of tracks. In fact, I've just put them on social media for this book. There's always about half a dozen tracks that somewhere along the line have they've either got into my head or usually albums, and I'm playing them over and over again when I'm writing. And I now post them up. And it's the wildest collection of stuff. But it's the music I was writing to at the time. I have to have music on and loud to write. I can't write in silence. I used to be dance music, used to be trance dance. Partly the reason I've got tinnitus is that, and I'm not kidding, it really is, or going to festivals. But music for me is a real energizer when you're writing. The downside is you've got to be careful what you play because you can start singing along to it. Or embarrassingly, I did this once. I like Chicane, a guy called Nick Bracegirdle with the band. He plays in Chicane. I love, and there's one track called Stoned in Love, which has got Tom Jones as the singer on it. It's a great track. And I was in the library. So just down the road from where I live now, in Glasgow, is the library I went to when I was a kid, when I was about 5 years old. And I sometimes did go down there to write. And I didn't know. You kind of lose track. I had my headphones on, and I suddenly realised I was getting signalled by the librarian to sit down because A, I was dancing, which is a bit daft in the library, and B, I wasn't on Bluetooth. It was on the wire, and I'd pulled the wire out. So the rest of the library was getting a full-on version of Chicane while I was dancing. So I get told by the librarian that's not very appropriate. Sit down.
That's great.
But I love music. Music is my way of. I can't write without music. I can give you the albums on each book when I'm going along. I can go back and say, yeah, that came out then. I can almost tie the book back to the album or back to the artist.
That's great. I agree. I can't work without some kind of noise, music, or something. Has to be. Can't work in silence.
No. And I think the other thing is, it shows in the book, like there's little snippets. Like, sad to say, how do you? I've been following OMD, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, since 1979, since the first single came out. I've seen them more times than make any sense. And my mates will keep telling me I'm an OMD nut. I don't think I am anymore. I kind of still go to see them, but I have seen them in Madrid. I have seen them in LA. I've seen them in some really weird places. And you used to be sneaking an OMD track into the book. Was kind of, and it does. If you go back and find it, you will find. I spent ages just sneaking an OMD track in. Someone was listening to one in the radio, or they had it on a CD, or they heard it in a shop. Used to do that, but one of the problems is you put lyrics in from a song. It can be it's a bit of a no-no. You're not meant to do it, which then means you can put the title in, but you can't put the lyrics in. And I used to love putting the lyrics in, so I've had to pull that back. So I've got that. So there's a kind of Easter egg of find the OMD track inside my book. I'm trying to think if there's one in The Fracture. I think there is. I actually think he does end up sitting at the airport listening to one.
We're going to have to go back and look. Although, I mean, I love this. I think if you sort of hear a band or you see a band mentioned in like a book or even little bits of lyrics or something like that, that there's something you like, it's like the band recommending the book to you.
Yeah. Well, Fode Mana, who wrote a really, really good book. I mean, the premise of the book is great, but it's partly Sierra Leone and it's partly set in Scotland. Started talking about this artist. In his book, he's starting chatting away about this artist and how good this artist is and how big this artist is in Sierra Leone and how this artist was a crossover artist and how influential it was. And I went searching for it. I think, right, okay, so this is obviously a Sierra Leone. I could find nothing, absolutely nothing. And I interviewed Fode and I said to Fode, please tell me this is like a hidden artist that you really like. And he went, no, I made it up. I was like, I was like on Google, I was in ChatGPT and I was thinking, I've got the name wrong. None of the name's right. Just created it. And I was like, I was all for buying the album. And all I'd done was read it in his book.
But don't you love when that happens though? Because it means that they've done such a good job of creating it. LEG did that in her first Harbinder book. She wrote a ghost story, like a Victorian ghost story that influenced it. And I genuinely believed it was a real ghost story and went looking for the author.
Oh yeah. That's good.
And I was like, I need to read this author. Why have I never read these before? And it's because she completely made it up.
Yeah, and that's the good thing from an author's point of view. I put stuff in, you make historical facts up, or you say, here's a place that exists and it doesn't. And you just, I'm more with places, a lot of the places I've got are real, because I'm one of these authors. I quite like to have been and seen, walk down the street or been in the house. Like when my very, not my first book, my third book, I can't put there's a reason for saying this. I can't put a sex scene in the book. My wife would just laugh her head off if I put a sex scene in the book. But there is a little bit of a guy getting caught something he shouldn't done. And my mum read the book. And then my mum phoned us up to have a chat with us. And I thought, I know she's going to mention this, right? I absolutely know I'm going to get a doing from my mother for putting anything like this in at all. And she didn't. She phoned up and said, look, see in the beginning, the first house they're in, that's your grand's old flat. She said, the second house they're in, that's the first house we lived in. She was dead right. I just borrowed the house. Because I remember my grand's house. So when you're describing characters inside it, the bathroom's there, the living room there, the kitchen's there, what was on the wall. I loved it. And I do that all the time. So for me, inventing places I have done, because occasionally I need to, like, especially in the Fracturing of the Cost, the pub in Fraserburgh that Charlie's friend owns doesn't exist. It's called the Sailor's Rest, but I know what it is. It's where the lifeboat house used to be. It's where the lifeboat used to run off the harbour and splash. Now it's not there. It's been developed into something else. But in my head, that's where the pub is. And I got asked by somebody, they were in Fraserburgh, asking where the pub was. And then when I wrote my books under Morgan Cry, set in Havia, which is where I am just now, but I changed the name of the village, but the pub itself that's in that book doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist in this town. However, it's the sort of pub that everybody that's been to Spain, especially years ago, where it's John Smith's on tap, there's currency on the ceiling that's been pinned up over the years, Sky Sports will be on, the Daily Mail, they'll do fish and chips, they'll do a roast dinner. It's one of those pubs, the pubs that's very, very, very British, but it's in Spain. And I can tell you what it is in town. I could walk you there in 20 minutes. It's all it is a car park, right? But people then say, where's the pub? Right, and it's called Se Busca, and which is the Spanish for the wanted, and it's like, why have you got this pub? And they keep saying, where is it? And that is one of the few times I've invented something, and people go, is it real? And I went, no, it doesn't exist. I kind of think I should open it. I've been asked about it that often.
Maybe.
Yeah.
You could have copies of your book for sale on the bar.
Oh yeah. Well, occasionally you do invent things because you can make it real, but it's better sometimes. It just gives you a bit more freedom, and also you don't face that thing. If somebody really owns the pub or really owns the whatever building, you kind of have to just be a bit careful. Whereas you make a pub up or make up a building or you do fine. But a lot of other stuff now, I would say a lot of my stuff, especially in the Fracture, because it goes between Fraserburgh and Glasgow, a lot of the stories like just literally come out of walking around Glasgow or walking around Fraserburgh. You see something like his name, Blake Glover, right? This is a story. It's a bit of an oddball name. If you go to Fraserburgh, there's a little garden now. There used to be nothing, but there's a little garden with a board up with the history of Thomas Blake Glover, right? And if you look up the history of Thomas Blake Glover in the 1800s, Thomas was born in Fraserburgh in the late 1800s. At the age of 19, he went to China, and at the age of 21, he went to Japan, right? And if you then look up what he did, so Kirin Brewery, which is one of the biggest breweries in Japan, he helped form it. Mitsubishi, one of the biggest engineering companies in the world, he helped form it. He was the guy who more or less, he helped bring the Industrial Revolution, the modern Industrial Revolution to Japan. He was the guy that brought modern shipbuilding to Japan. He helped build the modern Navy for Japan, right? Thomas Blake Glover. He got awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, second class, by the Emperor himself. He was known as the Scottish Samurai. His house is a visitor attraction, and he's quite a big deal in Japan. And in Fraserburgh now, they have something to do with him. And most people outside of there have never heard of Thomas Blake Glover. So the reason I called the main character Blake Glover was in the book, his mother said, Thomas Blake Glover was a hero for Fraserburgh. I want you to live your life like a hero. So she named him Blake Glover. And that's the Thomas Blake Glover. If you look it up, you'll find them. There's a whole bunch of stories about Thomas Blake Glover. So I just nicked his name.
That's a brilliant way of naming him, though. Because that's, again, it's going to draw people into the books and they're going to go away and look up.
Well, I mention it in the books because you can go and look them up. They've done a really little Zen garden, like a Japanese garden, and it's got his timeline on it. It used to not be there. The only thing they used to have was a blue plaque. You know, Thomas Blake Glover was born here in Commerce Street, I think it was, in 18, can't remember the date. Now they've got a little garden, and it's beautiful because it's like they've got a Zen part to the garden. You can just sit in the quiet. But he was such an important part to Japan. Look up Japanese history. He played a really, really important part in Japanese history. So I named him Blake Glover because of that.
We've got Sarah said, did you use any cafes, chippies, pubs from Fraserburgh in your book?
Yes, there is. There's quite a few. I mean, there's, in fact, I think in the Fracture, I probably name about 7 or 8 of the places that I used to know. There used to be old chippies. So because I go back in time when I'm talking about a kid, when you remember as a kid, there was like Charlie's the Chippy, there was Duthie's the Chippy. For Fraserburgh, people will remember this. Bicockies, which is still there, used to do the best ice cream in Fraserburgh. It's still there, did that as a business. Some of the other businesses used to be Maitland's, which is still there, used to do, that's where the furniture shop used to be. Woolies, Woolworths, which is long since gone, was famous for pick and mix, like which it was everywhere, but Woolworths in Fraserburgh. There was a whole bunch, Trails, who were the bookshop in Fraserburgh. And at the moment, some of the shops and some of the pubs, in fact, some of the pubs have just used the current ones. So I've actually used a few of them in there. Cafes, I've invented a couple, but a couple of them really exist. So I've kind of it just depended what I wanted to do. And the other good thing is I actually wrote part of the book in Fraserburgh. Again, I was sitting on the beach. I wrote part of it. I was sitting in the pub. I wrote part of it just because I was up in town doing some research, mainly trying to remember if I got things right. So there's like a pub like the Elizabethan. It really exists. The Sailor's Rest. It doesn't exist. So I have used, there's also on Mormont Hill, which is to the south of Fraserburgh, where there used to be a NATO communication station, American communication station up there. Huge big golf ball, used to be, was like massive communication station. On one side, there's a horse made out of white stones. You know, those sort of figures you get on a hill. And in the first book, I've got the kids playing a game running the length of it. And that's because when I was about 12 years old, we walked all the way out there. We were told it was like this mystery, like, I don't know, Stone Age figure that had been carved in the hill. You can see it for miles. It wasn't. It was 18 something. It was a local landover trying to impress somebody. He put animals either side of the hill. But the story was, oh my God, it's from the Stone Age. And when we were 12 years old. So there's lots of that in there. Same with Glasgow. I'm absolutely, in Glasgow, they get into Blackfriars pub, they're in Sloane's pubs, there's a lot of pubs, as you can tell, they're around Glasgow Green. There's a whole bunch of areas they go as well, where I kind of take them into, or I take Blake into. And again, I'm just being lazy, because I can kind of walk into Sloane's pub, and I know you turn left and you can go to the back and into the booth. Or I know you can go out the other side into an arcade, and again, I love doing that. I just like, kind of brings it to life for me as well.
Donna said Mark Billingham reckons authors are frustrated rock stars.
He plays on stage as well. I'm absolutely frustrated rock star. I can't play an instrument. If I did ever get to do anything, I can't do it, but I would DJ. I'd love dance music. I've had one moment in the limelight which I adored about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more than that. A company I was working for, I've got one bit of work left now, but all my work stuff's kind of gone for writing. And they decided to put on a proper festival. Not like, so main stage, side stage, campsite, restaurant, the whole works. 2 days. They had some really good bands on. They had Turin Breaks. They had Sunshine Underground. They had some really good bands on it. And I was part of the organisation because it kind of started off with something I did. And they were looking for a compere for 2 days on the stage to introduce the bands, right? So they needed someone to intro each of the bands, and I brought one of my mates from Scotland down, and the two of us put kilts on, and for 2 days we introed the bands. We interviewed them before, introed them, and then we DJ'd in between. So when they were setting up, we did the music in between. I adored it. I would love one day just to step on stage and do it. How rubbish I'd be, I don't care. I would just do it. And it's, for me, I think Mark's right. I mean, he does. He plays with the fun-loving crime writers. They get a chance to. They play Glastonbury, for God's sake. Like, you know, in terms of rock stars, it's harder to get better than Glastonbury. So my claim to fame is I played a festival in Cheshire. I didn't play anything. In fact, I should have taken my guitar. I can play about 4 chords. I should have just done it for the hell of it and actually strummed 4 chords on a stage.
Yeah, just so that you could see you'd played on stage.
Oh, I did it. I used to work in the brewery trade for years, and I remember I was working in the northeast of England, and you've got the huge big working men's clubs, massive clubs, thousands of members, massive turnover of beer, and some of them look terrible outside, but they're gorgeous inside, really well looked after, brilliant places to go. And I remember when there was a band playing that night, and the main hall maybe held 700 people. It's a huge big hall to hold all the people, all set out for that night. But they set the drums up and put the instruments up, but the band wasn't on for 2 hours. And I just said, I have never played a set of drums on stage. Never. Right? I can't play the drums. I have no idea how you play them. But the guy said, well, go and bash the drums. And I said, I can't. And the band members, the guys were there, said, oh, go and. So I had about 2 minutes of making this ridiculously bad noise just because I do it. And there was a wee drunk guy at the front gave me a round of applause. I was like, I wasn't the band, but I got one person gave me a round of applause. That's about my whole stage presence.
Patsy says good evening.
Good evening, Patsy.
Who is, I mean, you can't get a better champion of Scottish authors than Patsy.
Scottish author, I've got a bit of a passion because I was involved with Bloody Scotland from the outset at the Crime Writing Festival. It's such a privilege to see so many authors every year. This year was fantastic. That's a record year this year. We've never had a busier year than we did this year. But the one thing I remember was way back in 2016, you used to say to yourself, how do you give new authors a better chance? One of the things Bloody Scotland was born to do was to promote new authors. So like Pitch Perfect, which is a great example, was people just with ideas get the chance to pitch to 2 agents and 2 publishers. And we've had loads of deals out of that. We've had like just debut authors on stage. We now take debut authors and we mix them with the main authors. But one of the things we did was I come up with this idea called Crime in the Spotlight, which, because I like my live music, I will always go and see a support band. Always, right? I just feel I never know who I might see that's going to be famous. Like I never know who it's going to be, so I'll always go and see the support band. And I just said to myself, when we're at a meeting, I said, why don't we have a support band for the main stage? You know, if it's Mark Billingham or if it's Ian Rankin or it's Lee Child, whoever the main speakers are, why don't we give somebody 3 minutes in front of that audience to say, this is me, and read a little bit from the book? And every year we've had between, first year there was 6 people, including Graham McRae Burnett, who was in the first year before he was famous for his bloody project. This year we had 15. So far we've had 151 authors as support that we've taken to the stage, and they're all brilliant. I mean, it's a nerve-wracking thing to do if you've not done it. They're all debut authors. They're either on their first book, some their second, some not even their first book, and they all get a chance to stand in front of a huge crowd because our main venue holds up to 700 people. And I like that because that's the future of writing. It's those younger ones or the new, not even younger. It's never younger because a lot of the ones that have broken through, I was in my 50s before I actually got anywhere. And a lot of them, we're not age, doesn't matter. It's just a case of giving them a chance. And I love that. That's one of the things I love about being involved in Bloody Scotland, is just seeing all these new authors coming through.
I love that. One of my favourite bands to see live, I first saw as a support act.
And who was that?
The Skints.
All right, the Skids.
Yeah, the Skints.
SKIDS, no.
No, SKINTS. The Skints.
Oh, yeah, I know who you mean. So I thought you meant this. I just saw the Skids, SKIDS, about 4 weeks ago. I know that's and we've had some brilliant authors on stage, like authors that have then gone on to get multiple book deals, who are now fixtures at the festival, but doing the main stage. But they were originally one of the ones that walked on and did the kind of debut author. I'll give you a good Natalie Jane Clark, who's done the Malt Whiskey Murders, is the book, her debut book this year. I met at Bloody Scotland. They were doing a podcast, and me and her were on the podcast with Linwood Bartley. It was just one of those. They were looking for authors. We were in the room. We sat down to do it. And having had a chat with her, one of our sponsors, Lumo, one of the bloody Scotland sponsors, is the train company that runs from Edinburgh to King's Cross. And out of that, we come up with this madcap idea on the Wednesday before bloody Scotland that me, Natalie and Douglas Skelton got on a train at 9:35 in Edinburgh, and between the three of us wrote a short story, got to King's Cross, spent 40 minutes in King's Cross, got the train back to Edinburgh and wrote a second short story. And we got loads of coverage for doing something as mad as that. And it was Douglas and me who've done tons of books, and Natalie who's new to the scene. And for me, that's the joy, is seeing new people coming through.
It's genuinely a festival I really, really want to go and go to, but the McIlvenney and the debut prize list give me so many of my favourite authors.
Oh,
like it's hands down my favourite book prize. Like, yeah. I will go and read everyone on it because there's so many authors now that are just insta buys for me that I've discovered from those.
And it's so competitive every year. I mean, the mix between debuts. I mean, we've had Callum McSorley, who was a debut author, won the McIlvanney with a debut, and then we've had authors who have written, 10 books in, they win the McIlvanney. And for me, that's the joy of it, is that every year the diversity of entries that go into it is just amazing. I've not won it yet, but that's well, one day.
Well, you might one day. I mean, it sounds like this series has got potential.
It does. I mean, it's down to the publisher. There's 2 more books in the series. It's down to them whether they go with them. We'll hear back at some point, and because it's only just out in hardback, the paperback's not out until the 26th of May. So we'll hear back. But there's at least 2 more in this if they go ahead with it. So Blake's around for 2 more in terms of both Fraserburgh. It's more Fraserburgh again. The next 2 kind of keep him in Fraserburgh. One of them, he has to go on the run, which is great, and the other one's all to do with he's got a bit of a love story. So there's kind of 2 different ways to approach it. But I like it because it kind of writes itself. You just drop him in Fraserburgh and put him in a taxi, and it takes about 5 minutes for something to happen. I always say that. On you go.
Go on, carry on.
I always say that it's not you always hear authors saying, well, the characters do their own thing, they won't do what you tell them, and that's not strictly true. It's usually, but it is true sometimes. You just decide to do something to a character for the hell of it. Somebody gets in a taxi that shouldn't, or say they crash if it was in a taxi, or somebody walks into the room. It's that that classic, and the whole book changes. For me, because I'm not a planner, the whole book changes, and I like that. That's the great thing. I could put anybody in a taxi and change the book completely.
Keeping track of the things that people are saying. Patsy's a fan of Alistair Liddell. I think she just enjoyed his new book. He's one of my discoveries from the Bloody Scotland lists.
Oh, I read his last book. Really good. Yeah, no, it was good. Yeah,
such a good author.
Yeah.
These ones, because they're almost like a bit of a love letter to your dad as well.
Yeah.
Would you ever be tempted to go back, sort of keep the setting, and go back and do, like you said, a historical one, and maybe make it a bit more?
Well, the first book goes back to his childhood. So the first book takes you through why he left. So there is a bit in it. But funnily enough, the second book, there's a little bit about him as a kid. And the third and fourth book, it drifts, because stuff happens when he was a kid. Because now he's back. There's such a big gap between it that his memory is either as a child or now. And therefore, it's quite easy to drop back in time to when he was a kid at the same time. And I did have an idea, because he's not been back, but I always had the idea that there might be, it's not a spin-off, that isn't right. So one of the characters that seems to have got a bit of traction is there's a friend of Blake's mother. So Blake's mother would be, well in her 80s, but there's still a friend called Mrs. Lang, right? And Mrs. Lang is a laugh. I love writing her. She just says it as it is. She's no filter. It's one of those ones where she's at an age where she doesn't care. I'll just say it the way it is. And she's got a hell of a backstory because of that. And I keep thinking there's something in that, because she's lived her whole life in the town and she knows everything that's going on. She knows all where the skeletons are all hidden. And she's quite happy to say it. She's absolutely no. And she does really strange things, like she won't let you in the house. No one ever gets in her house, ever. Full stop. No one's ever been in her house. And I love that there's a character in there. And someone asked me to write a short story about her. And I kind of think maybe there is one in there. because there's that. So that for me, it's quite a rich seam because there is a lot of history in there.
Well, yeah, because now we need to know why she won't let anyone in the house.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. So it's something I have to come up with a reason, but she will not let anyone. You're not allowed in the house. You're not allowed across the threshold. She leaves the messages when she's doing the shopping, have to be left outside. You cannot go inside the house. Now, I don't know what's in the house, but you're not allowed inside the house. And it's a bit like the other thing I like is Blake, like his diet's appalling. All he eats is Mars bars and Iron Brew and pasties. Like the whole book. I don't think he's ever sat down for a full meal in 2 books. He just eats rubbish all the time. And I love that. It's just like he keeps going to the petrol. He keeps telling himself tomorrow I'm going to change. And he doesn't. And there's something about the fact that when he was a police officer, and I've just written a short story, and right at the beginning of the short story, he goes to go on the beat at 11 o'clock at night, and the first thing he has is a fish supper. And for me, that's the joy of writing about something you know quite well, because you can play. Because I love that. It's not me. I don't even eat sweets, but the whole idea that you can have. There's no way you can survive that long if you just keep. But that's all he eats. That's his diet.
Although Iron Brew is a drink of the gods, so.
Oh, Iron Brew Extra as well, which is like, yeah. The only thing about me and caffeine, I talk quick enough. Give me too much caffeine and I'm out the door. Like I gibber like an idiot. So for me, there's only so much caffeine I can have.
No, I'm a teacher. I'm powered by caffeine. Just more the merrier.
You were talking about history. I know we're kind of running out of time, but just one bit of news, which I don't know if went out, but I have got another deal for books coming down the line. So not to do with the Blake Glover series at the moment. That's still, we'll see where that goes. But I wrote a short story for a festival called Bute Noir. So Craig Robertson, who's on the board with me at Bloody Scotland, runs a festival in Bute, the Isle of Bute. And a good few years ago, I was appearing, and to do a bit of publicity, I wrote a short story about there was 5 women on the island accused of witchcraft, which is disgraceful. And back then, you could be accused of witchcraft. It's the 1600s for anything. I mean, you just accuse someone of witchcraft, and they could be executed and tortured. But 5 of them were arrested. 5 were kept in jail. 1 escaped, made their way to the mainland, and then 12 years later came back and was executed. No one really knows why they came back. I wrote it as a short story. And in between writing these books, I said to Francesca, my agent, do you think there's a novel in this? And we had a to and fro. And now there's a full novel, starts in Bute, ends up in Dundee with an advocate called George Mackenzie. It's a story about it's a story about regicide. It's a story to attempt to kill the king at the same time, and it's a story about witchcraft. And Severn House have taken 2 of them. So the first one will be called Dark Accords and comes out on December 2026, and the second one, I think it's May or something 27, and it's going to cost. It'll be called It Will Never Be Over. So first book set in 1662, and the second book is set in 1663.
You need to remind me when those are coming out and book back in for a chat, because I love.
Oh, well, I will at the time. Yeah, they were great. Writing about history back then is amazing. Suddenly, not just research, how little's known, but so there is a historical element to me. I will have 2 historical crime books out.
I think it's historical crime's fabulous. Right, remind people in the minute that you've got left what they're going away to buy.
So The Fracture is the second in the Blake Glover series. It stars Blake Glover, who's an ex-police constable who is returned to Fraserburgh after 40 years. And the way to remember this book is I had to remember, because there's 3 strands to it. There's the Davy dilemma, and that's because the guy that they think's killed himself is called Davy. So there's a dilemma he has to solve. There's the Mitch madness, because Mitch Campbell is the guy that's the criminal that used to be a police officer with him, and he brings them down. So it's the Davy dilemma, the Mitch madness, and the coffin curiosity, because at the funeral, he sees the coffin split. And all 3 of those, he's the only person that's able to figure out. So he feels obliged to find out why the coffin split. He feels obliged to find out why somebody would kill themselves, and he's blackmailed into doing something by Mitch. So the 3 of those strands go together to make The Fracture.
Wonderful. And then just very quickly, give us one book recommendation of something you've read recently and enjoyed.
This is not a crime book, right? If you want a really off-the-wall recommendation, I'm just about finished. It's Miriam Margolis's autobiography. I think it's this much is true. Everything you've ever seen Miriam do when she's been on Graham Norton or heard it is a fraction of what you read. I can't stop reading this book. She is just mad, and it's a wonderful escapist book, and she's so honest with it. But I'm sitting up till 2 a.m. and laughing my head off. So it's not a crime book. It's not. If you don't want it, it's got nothing to do with crime. But if you want something for a laugh, Miriam's autobiography is just worth a read.
Brilliant. And then all that's left to say is thanks for joining us.
No, Kazan, thank you very much for stepping in. It's been brilliant. This has been great. UK Crime Book Club is such a great thing, and I appreciate being able to come on and talk to everybody. So just thanks to everybody that's tuned in for coming along tonight. It's been brilliant.